The spring of 1979 proved to be the most active period of documented UFO sightings in the history of the Bridgewater Triangle region.
This is a story of a couple Bigfoot that tossed two of our miners up on Hoyt Peak back 20 years ago.
Nestled in the woods in the middle of Denton County lies Old Alton Bridge. Built in 1884, it's better known as Goatman's Bridge.
We've heard of the ghosts that haunt the shores, the lizard men of the swamps. But one tale has yet to be let off its leash.
You got to see this story tonight. A couple is sharing their experience of living in a Hillsborough house. They say it's haunted.
I could not do this. CBS 17's Bridget Chapman spoke to the Maxwells about their time in the house and dug into the dark history of that property.
He worked for the Counts. He was the second one, actually. But his body was found shortly before the Great Depression at the corner of West Washington and Green Street. He had jumped from one of the third floor windows.
turned upside down, and hold on. He says the carpet's been ripped up and the shower is on, but nobody's in there. Man, that's scary. I'm officially freaked out now.
And number 4 now, it is video of the unknown. What is it? Is it real? And what is it doing there? A family in Highland, Michigan believes their house is actually haunted and thinks something is harming their little girl. Connection News reporter Alan Campbell went to the home to see for himself.
It happened here in this room as 15-month-old Lily was inside her bed. Caught on camera, something walks in front of her, catching Lily's attention. Whatever it is, the family says it needs to go.
It's almost like she sees something that we don't.
It's an image Heather and Josh say is haunting their home.
It was chilling. It was literally a chill down your spine, like that what if factor. Like, is this what I just saw?
Caught on the couple's dating cam video a few weeks ago, what appears to be something moving in front of the baby crib.
I freaked out. I stopped what I was doing and I ran upstairs and I grabbed my daughter.
Heather says this so-called ghost scratched her daughter Lily and attacked her too.
It scares us that it could do something else. I mean, there was even a morning that I woke up and I felt like something was around like someone's hands were around my neck.
A team of paranormal investigators came in and tried answering some of the couple's questions and concerns. His father, Jim, says it may be someone who lived in this house before.
The story that I was told was the gentleman that lived here originally committed suicide, apparently, by jumping out this window. Which is, of course, one full story down.
The couple says they don't know why this so-called ghost is targeting them, but say they don't want any part of it.
It's not physically just going after her. It feels like it's going after myself, too.
I couldn't get an explanation out of it. So it's freaky, is what it is.
Shattered windshields, hoof prints, and neighing. Welcome to Donkey Lady Bridge, a ghost story that goes back decades.
The lady was badly burnt in a fire, and she was distorted, and her hands became almost to look like hoofs, and they were heavily scarred, and her face was elongated, and she sort of looked like a horse.
Throughout the years, many visitors here have told the story of seeing this woman or seeing this beast, but like the supposed encounters, there's more than one story about how this haunting began.
UFO sightings in the history of the Bridgewater Triangle region. A number of news outlets and law enforcement agencies were flooded with reports of large, low-flying UFOs. During that time, former WHDH reporters Jerry Lopes and Steve Sprazia claimed to have witnessed what is arguably the most famous UFO sighting to occur within the Bridgewater Triangle.
Jerry Lopes and I worked at WHDH Radio, and we were heading down to the Raynham Dog Track, and when we got off 24 onto 106, I noticed this really bright light over the tree line, and the light was coming closer and closer and getting bigger and bigger. And I remember saying to Jerry, what is that over there? So we pulled his vehicle over, and all of a sudden the stars blotted out in the shape of an arrow as this thing passed overhead.
Ironically, big baseball fan, it looked like a baseball home plate, and there were a series of lights on it.
And it was very, very wide. Perhaps the width of now, we'd say 5 747s wing to wing.
It looked like it had a little cord or something hanging off of it. Sparks were coming off of it. I almost felt like I could throw a rock at the thing. It seemed that close to me.
This was pretty much the shape of it. And this thing passed overhead like this. For me, what first attracted me was this light that kind of came into our field of vision, just like that. And as this thing passed overhead, it just kept coming and coming and coming. The light kept getting bigger and bigger.
Sorry, guys. Fuck. Had it muted, guys. All right, everybody. Thank you. It's a Friday night, and we're going to start doing something a little bit different from now on Fridays. Just have a little bit more fun. Stories of the supernatural, ghost stories, UFOs, aliens, anything that might be just a little bit more on the fun side. So please, anything that you have in mind, you want to reach out and send it to me. I'm also going to be introducing a new host tonight, Jason from New York. And then I'm going to be we're going to be interviewing special guest Aaron Cadieux, who we've had on before with the New Bedford serial killings. I just want to play a clip of his documentary series on the Bridgewater Triangle. So let me just bring that on. And full trailer, and then I'll give you a taste for it, and then we'll bring Aaron right on.
In 1975, I moved from California to Cambridge, Massachusetts. I started picking up on this whole notion that there was an area in southeast Massachusetts that almost was a magnet of weird phenomena, and really noticed it was a triangle.
Whatever it is, we keep talking about this region for some reason.
I certainly think that the Hockomock Swamp serves as the epicenter of activity in the Bridgewater Triangle.
Off in the distance was an extremely large, man-like creature.
I saw something that I'll never forget for the rest of my life. I saw what appeared to be the Sasquatch creature that I heard about.
Suddenly, I saw something walk. It was about 3 or 4 feet tall. It wanted to get me in its space. This is what I felt like.
A lot of people seem to think that because of King Philip's War, the Native Americans placed a curse on the Bridgewater Triangle region.
One of the greatest paranormal experiences occurred at Anawan Rock. As I turned around, I met the eyes of an older man.
The 1970s in particular were a time of very high UFO activity in the Bridgewater Triangle.
Jerry Lopes and I were heading down to the Raynham dog track, and all of a sudden the stars blotted out in the shape of an arrow as this thing passed overhead.
I almost felt like I could throw a rock at the thing. It seemed that close to me.
I pulled over the Raynham dog track parking lot. I'm right under this wharf as it's birthing these ships. What I seen was definitely not from this world.
A lot of criminal cult activity happened in the Freetown State Forest.
We had evidence that rituals taking place in the state forest. Then there was a huge amount of calves with the absence of blood.
This mausoleum was broken into, and juveniles actually stole the head out of here.
They believed that they could gain power by drinking from the skull.
Legends and stories about the Bridgewater Triangle will never stop. Nobody can argue that there isn't something very special about this area.
Something real happened here. There's no other way.
All right, guys, I want to introduce you to a new host that we're going to have on the channel a lot here, in particular for this show, Yellow Cottage X. This is Jay. He's in New York City. Hey, Jay, nice to have you. Let me make sure your mic is on. All right there, brother.
Hi, Kevin. How you doing, man?
Very good. So just want the audience to meet you and give us an idea about some of the stuff that you're working on.
Yeah, sure. So we've got a lot of interesting things in the works. I've been reached out to a number of ghost hunting organizations, and I've got a couple interviews lined up with those folks. Lots of interesting stories to share. I have an interview with a witch who works at the only magic and occult store here I'm in Brooklyn, in Manhattan, I should say. And she's got a lot of fun stories. She's a real personality too. And I also have an interview in the future. I've got to set up the exact date with the Rhine Research Center down in North Carolina. The Rhine Research Center does research into parapsychological phenomena, things like ESP and telekinesis and things like that. So constantly looking for new stuff. If any of the viewers out there have any suggestions, we're always welcome. Love to find them. Also thinking of expanding into some of the UFO organizations around the area. Well, anywhere actually. Anyone, we'll take, I'll talk to anyone across the country. So it doesn't really matter to me. And that's about it. That's what I'm working on right now. It's trying to juggle a bunch of flaming torches because, you know, everyone's schedule is always different and whatever, but it is coming into focus. So I'm really excited to be here, guys.
Okay, excellent. Tonight's episode is sponsored by Guinness, but it's a little different on our regular show. It's a Friday night, so we can kick back and relax. So if you have a drink, get one. Maybe we'll have on some more guests later. But Aaron just stepped away from his mic for a second. So as soon as he comes back, we'll bring him on. But Aaron was a great guest. He's done years of research into the New Bedford serial killings, and we had him on a couple months ago. And then he also has this documentary on the Bridgewater Triangle. So he's back. Let me bring on Aaron. Hey, Aaron.
Hey, guys. First of all, can you see and hear me okay?
Yes, we
can.
can.
I know, I'm kind of, yeah. So I'm camping this weekend because my daughter has a soccer tournament on Cape Cod. So my parents and I are at a campground right now, and I'm using my phone. I'm usually on my laptop.
Oh, well, no, we hear you fine. And I was hoping you were going to say you're camped out in the middle of Hockomock Swamp.
That would have been more fun.
That's what I thought. Hi, Aaron. Nice to meet you.
Hi, how are you? Nice to meet you.
That's what I thought you were going to tell us you were coming from, was the middle of the triangle.
No, I'm in the middle of Brewster, Massachusetts on Cape Cod at a campground. In my car.
We know that. I've been in that campground where they have the yurts there, right? Nickerson Park?
No, this is Shady Knoll. I'm at the Shady Knoll campground.
Oh, okay. All right. Aaron, I don't know if do you have a control over your volume on yours at all? If you can, someone said that your volume might be a little higher than ours. If it's
a little higher. Hang on.
Turn it down a little bit, actually. Yours is a little higher, yeah. Just a tad bit.
I don't know if there's a way to do that on a phone.
Yeah, don't worry about that. Don't worry about it. We'll
all right.
Yep.
If I go a little further away from the phone, maybe, and not talk so loud.
Yeah, don't worry about it because you're going to be doing most of the talking anyways. So as long as people can hear our questions. So one of the I want to ask later on as we get into this about the idea of certain places such as like Skinwalker Ranch and maybe the bridge that the Bridgewater Triangle that might have some kind of evil or might be a portal to something. I think that's a subject that's fascinating to people. But why don't you just begin by telling us about the triangle itself? What is the Bridgewater Triangle?
Okay, so this is coming from a major wet blanket skeptic. So that's me. The Bridgewater Triangle is a 200 square mile region in southeastern Massachusetts that was first defined by cryptozoologist Loren Coleman, who's kind of the godfather of cryptozoology. In the late 70s, he had moved from California to Massachusetts. And when he started doing research in cryptozoology in Massachusetts, he kept getting a series of reports of odd occurrences and odd sightings in southeastern Massachusetts, kind of plotted the points on a map. And because the Bermuda Triangle was a popular topic at the time, he kind of coined the phrase the Bridgewater Triangle. And by plotting these points on the map, came up with this rough triangle. And then he set the boundaries for the triangle being the town of Abington to the north, the town of Freetown to the southeast, and the town of Rehoboth to the southwest, and everything in between. And that's when the Bridgewater Triangle was born. It actually was first mentioned, I believe, in 1978 in a Boston magazine article, but came to national prominence in Loren Coleman's book in 1983 called Mysterious America. And the phenomenon reported in the Bridgewater Triangle range everywhere from Bigfoot and cryptids, thunderbirds, giant snakes, of course, ghost sightings. And then when it comes to the Freetown State Forest portion of the triangle in particular, there's a long history of bizarre true crime stories coming out of the Freetown State Forest. But within the 200 square mile triangle, probably the two most well-known locations within the triangle are the Hockomock Swamp, which is often seen as like the beating heart of the Bridgewater Triangle, and then the Freetown State Forest in the lower right-hand portion of the triangle. And there are various locations within the triangle, but those two are probably the most famous.
Aaron, was the State Forest where the satanic cult occurrences?
Alleged satanic cult. Okay. It's never been substantiated, but there have been, especially in the 70s and 80s, which was, at the peak of the satanic panic.
Right.
There was a lot of, satanic graffiti but then they did find small animals that had been sacrificed at the center of pentagrams. And then there was, at one point they were finding the carcasses of cattle out in the Freetown State Forest, and the most graphic would have been, and it's featured in the documentary, they found a dozen baby calves which had been butchered in the Freetown State Forest, and it was alleged that it could have been part of a satanic ritual, but that was never substantiated.
I see. Okay.
Let's go back a little bit to the beginning.
Sure.
So is Hockomock Swamp, is that the center of events, would you say?
I think, I think that's often seen as like the beating, lack of a better term, beating heart of the Bridgewater Triangle. I think it's about a 5,000 acre wetland, and it's in the towns of Bridgewater, West Bridgewater, Taunton, Easton, Norton. It kind of bleeds into several towns in that center of the triangle there. It's I think it's the largest swamp in New England, maybe in Massachusetts, but it could be New England, maybe Massachusetts, but it is a very large swamp.
Yeah, the other interesting thing about these kind of swamps is that if you know anything about, well, I'm sure you do, but to people that don't, in this area of New England, when the Pilgrims and the other early settlers came here from, the English in the early 1600s, within 20 years, they had wiped out every bit of forest everywhere from like here to Springfield in order to build their farms. So very little got left, but something like a swamp would still be kind of in its primordial state. And that's probably why the Indians during King Philip's War made that kind of a center, because that was an area they could, easily hide in, and because it was a large area that was still unsettled or was the trees had not been destroyed yet. And
yes,
it was swamps were at the time of King Philip's War were a place where the natives would launch their raids and attacks from a swamp, because I think the colonists had a disdain for swamps. I think they saw them as like scary or forbidding places. I mean, you're talking about the Puritans, who were probably the most superstitious people that ever set foot on the soil in America. So they were the type of people that if there was a lunar eclipse, there was some sort of a superstitious reason for it. And actually, at the start of King Philip's War in 1675, the war began under a lunar eclipse. And of course, the colonists saw that as like an omen.
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to add too, I know from a little bit of history I picked up that the swamps are often seen as like demonic or devilish because they couldn't be conquered. They couldn't be like, the trees couldn't be harvested, and they weren't useful to a lot of, for the settlers. So they kind of assigned them as an evil place that was like, devoid of God, so to speak, where God's power didn't reach as it did into the forests or the fields or something like that.
Absolutely. And, you talk about the Hockomock Swamp. Even today, it's located in southeastern Massachusetts in a heavily populated region of the state. There are probably sections of that swamp that have never seen never seen mankind. There are parts of that swamp that are completely inaccessible. Maybe in the wintertime when things are frozen, you can make your way into those parts of the swamp, but in the other 3 seasons, it would be almost impossible.
That's incredible, especially in this day and age, that there's still unexplored areas.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about it. You're in this hustle and bustle south of Boston, but there's this swamp where, it's easy to see why people's imaginations might run away with them when it comes to the Hockomock Swamp, because it's just so vast, and there are parts of it that are so just remote and inaccessible.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing.
Another interesting thing that caught my eye was the 1908, let's call it a UFO experience. Tell us about that, with a flying lantern or something like that witnessed.
Yeah. My partner on the documentary, the co-director, Manny Famolari, had that newspaper article. And it's one of the more well-known UFO. That's another thing I didn't add to the list earlier, a large amount of UFO sightings in the Bridgewater Triangle. But it happened on Halloween night back in 1908, and it was supposedly two carriage driving undertakers, of course, on Halloween night, were driving their carriage and saw this mysterious, what looked like a large lantern floating in the sky above Bridgewater. And it was never discovered what they actually saw, but that was one of the first documented UFO sightings in the Bridgewater Triangle region.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see those, because those are before the idea of UFOs captured the public imagination. So, and there are
absolutely,
and before
happened. Yeah, go ahead.
Before drones and things like an aircraft that easily fob it off and just say, "Oh, it was a balloon, weather balloon, or something like that." And it's obviously long before those things came about.
Absolutely.
Aaron, as someone who is, I'm also, skeptical of these kind of things too, but I love a good story.
Me too.
And
That's why we did the documentary.
yeah, and I'm open to anything, and especially on a Friday night, you're drinking or whatever. Like I just am. So, what of all the things you looked into, what's the thing that kind of maybe creeped you out the most, or made you give it that little hair stand in the back of your neck?
I say this in every interview I ever give about the Bridgewater Triangle. I walked into the project probably like a 99% skeptic and walked out of the project probably like a 96. So there were a few things that we learned about, and also something that I personally experienced in the making of the documentary. And even as a skeptic made me kind of like scratch my head and, say, what was that all about? So it's kind of a long story, but you mentioned the King Philip's War. For those that are listening that don't know what that is, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620, and at the time they became allies to the Wampanoag tribe in present-day Massachusetts. And the chief of the Wampanoag at the time was Massasoit. He had two sons who the English called, they were Wamsutta and Metacom, but the English called them Metacom and Alexander. They called them Philip and Alexander. Alexander passed away, but Philip eventually became chief of the Wampanoag. And by 1675, 50 years after the Pilgrims have landed, the Wampanoag rebelled against English oppression. The English were encroaching on their lands, placing a lot of restrictions on weapons ownership and things of that nature. And so the Native Americans rebelled in what is the bloodiest war on a per capita basis in American history. About 5% of New England's combined population was completely wiped off the map. The vast majority of the Native American population in southeastern Massachusetts and beyond in New England was rounded up and sold into slavery if they did not convert to Christianity. And there were towns out in western Massachusetts that were victims of native raids that were so badly destroyed that it took 70 years for some of these towns to be re-inhabited. So it was just an absolutely brutal conflict. It was like a no holds barred type of a situation with the murder of innocent women and children on both sides. And it was just a really, really brutal conflict. And some people claim that the negative energies from that conflict are what caused the negative energies in the Bridgewater Triangle. That's one of the running theories. And the reason I'm giving that backstory is that one of the theories that kind of is an offshoot of that, at the very end of King Philip's War, I think Philip sensed that the end was near for him, and he gave his wampum belt, which was basically a visual narrative of the history of the Wampanoag people on this belt in a form, in like an artwork. He gave it to his war chief, Anawan, to carry the belt on through the remainder of the conflict. And it wasn't long after that King Philip was hunted down and killed in present-day Bristol, Rhode Island. But his war chief was this guy, Anawan, and the war continued for a very brief period of time after that, and the last of the Wampanoag were being rounded up. The last of the warriors that were still, active in the field were being tracked down and rounded up. And the leader of the colonial, well, I shouldn't say the leader, a higher up in the colonial militia was a guy named Benjamin Church, who was one of the first pioneers of like ranger warfare and, creeping through the woods, hiding behind things to take your shot, that kind of thing. He had a small party of colonists and native praying Indians that helped him track down Anawan, and Anawan and his last band of Wampanoags were tracked down to a place in present-day Rehoboth, Massachusetts called Anawan Rock, and he peacefully surrendered to Benjamin Church and actually presented Benjamin Church with this wampum belt as a symbol of his surrender. And nobody knows what happened to this wampum belt. It's disappeared from history. Nobody knows if it wound up sinking on a ship on a cross-Atlantic journey back to England, or if it's tucked away in a drawer in a museum somewhere. But one of the running theories is that the bizarre occurrences in the Bridgewater Triangle will continue until the wampum belt is returned to the Native American people. Now, saying that, one of the interviews we shot in the documentary was with Christopher Balzano, who has written a couple of books about the Bridgewater Triangle and now lives in Florida. And back in 2008, he was giving a tour. He had come up from Florida and was giving a tour of the Freetown State Forest. I tagged along to get footage of him giving this tour. This was in the infancy of possibly thinking about doing a documentary in the Bridgewater Triangle. At the end of the tour, he was supposed to go to a bookstore to do book signings for his book, but he locked his keys in his car and had to call AAA. But because we were out in the middle of the Freetown State Forest, AAA said it could be a couple of hours before we get there. So I took the opportunity to do an impromptu interview with Chris out in the middle of the Freetown State Forest, but it was dark, so we had to use battery-operated lights to light the interview. And we put brand new batteries in these lights. We're running the interview, and Chris starts telling the story about the wampum belt and how the theory is that the wampum belt will not, the things in the Bridgewater Triangle will continue until the wampum belts return to the Native Americans. And while he was talking about that, the lights shut off. So we had to get everything back up and running. And this is all in the documentary, all caught on camera. We get everything back up and running, and somebody who was with us said, "Hey guys, you realize that the lights went out when Chris started talking about the wampum belt?" And we all kind of chuckled. And then Chris, in like a joking fashion, as if he was like talking to a ghost, said, "We hear your message. If we could, we would return it." As soon as he said that, the light shut off a second time.
Yo.
And this plays out right in the documentary in the section about Anawan Rock. And even as a skeptic, the hair on my arm was standing up, the hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and it was one of the, it's probably the closest thing, it is the closest thing I've ever had to what somebody would consider to be, you know, a paranormal occurrence.
Right. Aaron, one thing you mentioned that was kind of the beginning of the strangeness, and that are there not also Native American myths that go back in that area though? It's little people.
One of the supposed legends of the area tied to the Native Americans is the existence of these small troll-like creatures called pukwudgies.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And that's one of the most popular, you know, creature sightings in the Bridgewater Triangle, particularly in the Freetown State Forest. A lot of people reportedly have these run-ins with these pukwudgies. I've never seen one. But they're supposed to be small troll-like creatures with magical powers that can appear and disappear, shoot poisonous arrows. They kind of were initially a mischievous creature who through time have become more sinister, and they will supposedly like draw you in and lead you to your death. And that's one of the stories that comes out of the Freetown State Forest.
Well, I find that interesting because I've been reading a book by a man named Patrick Harper about, it's called The Philosopher's Secret Fire, about the history of the human imagination. It goes much deeper, but he mentions that an interesting fact, every culture on the planet has a little people.
Mm-hmm.
From the Africa, every continent, the Inuit people, everybody has a story of some kind of little goblins or fairies or whatever it may be. So I found when I heard that, I watched the documentary a few weeks ago, it really kind of set a trigger off. I was like, oh, here we go. We've got our own version here.
Yeah. It's a local version of, you know, the same kind of phenomenon that's being, you know, reported all over the world.
Yeah, right.
One of the cool things I saw in the documentary was, you know, we've kind of alluded to the idea that possibly if there's any evil or haunting going on here, that it traces its roots to King Philip's War, but that the other possibility is that King Philip's War was actually a result of something older that is already there. So if you kind of embrace your inner Stephen King, you know, what might that kind of be?
Well, the interesting thing about King Philip's War is it spread throughout all of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, parts of Connecticut, and eventually the war in a way continued up into Maine and kind of morphed into the French and Indian War, which lasted 70 years. Mm-hmm. Hang on one second. Thank you. So I just got some water and food delivered to me.
Please share.
So the Bridgewater Triangle is just a small 200 square mile region of Massachusetts, but King Philip's War engulfed a large portion of New England. So that whole, the war caused the triangle thing. I don't believe in any of this stuff really, but to me, that doesn't make a lot of sense because the war was so vast and covered such a large geographical region. Now, the war began in Swansea, Massachusetts, which is not too far outside the Bridgewater Triangle area in southeastern Massachusetts. So if you want to say the triangle potentially sparked the war, if you believe in this kind of thing, I think that would be the theory that would make more sense.
Yeah, and it's certainly like what you know, we've spent a lot of time going over on this channel, Bridgewater State Hospital, and the number of evil figures that have inhabited that place over the recent decades. So it's definitely has its fair share of living monsters there too, you know.
Well, that's Yeah, that's one of the things that we go back to. You list off the things about the Bridgewater Triangle, and they're usually things that in and of themselves are not linked together. You got cryptids, and you got UFOs, and you got ghosts, and you got this true crime stuff.
Yeah.
And that's where that human sinister element comes in. And we brushed on it earlier. The Freetown State Forest in particular has a very long history of bizarre crime attached to it. And then it becomes a question of, did the negative energy of the Bridgewater Triangle cause the Freetown State Forest to have this reputation, or to draw in this sinister human element to it?
Is that where Mary Lou Aruda was found?
Yeah, Mary Lou Aruda was a 15-year-old girl from a nearby town called Raynham, and she was out riding her bike one day, and somebody abducted her, and she was missing for quite a period of time. And then in November of 1978, a couple of dirt bikers in the Freetown State Forest found her decomposed body tied to a tree. And it went on to be one of the most well-known murder cases in Massachusetts history. And the guy who was convicted of that crime was a man named James Cadieux, who has since passed away. And he ended up getting like 4 new trials, and it wasn't until the mid '90s that he was finally convicted officially on that murder. But the interesting thing about the Mary Lou Aruda case is that it happened around the same time that a lot of this evidence of alleged satanic activity was popping up in the Freetown State Forest. You got to remember, this was like the late '70s, heading into the '80s. Rock and roll music with, alleged satanic ties was a thing, and this whole satanic panic was brewing. And a lot of things were being attributed to satanic cults that weren't necessarily a result of a satanic cult. And this murder of Mary Lou Aruda was one of them, because this happened only a year before 3 prostitutes from the nearby city of Fall River, which is already famous as the place for the Lizzie Borden murders back in 1892, Fall River borders Freetown. There were 3 women from the Fall River who were murdered as part of an alleged satanic cult made up of a lot of pimps and prostitutes that were working in the city, were allegedly part of the satanic cult, which also was allegedly conducting rituals in the Freetown State Forest. So when the Mary Lou Aruda thing happened in 1978, eventually James Cadieux, his defense attorney, tried to convince the jury that Mary Lou Aruda could have been the victim of a satanic cult and not murdered at the hands of James Cadieux. So to the general public who doesn't know a lot about those cases, the Mary Lou Aruda case and the satanic cult murders in Fall River often get tied in together with each other and confused with one another, even though Mary Lou Aruda's murder had nothing to do with a satanic cult.
Cool.
Well, the other thing, and I don't know if this is in that same exact area, but in your documentary, there was an underground lair that was found here. Yeah, that was kind of similar to that.
Yeah, actually, we were lucky enough to find somebody who was able to lead us to the remains of that bunker. But back in the 80s, somebody stumbled onto this bizarre underground bunker in the middle of the woods. Of course, it had, satanic graffiti all over the place, these tiny little chairs with like straps on them that looked like you could like strap a toddler to. And they were like dolls' heads nailed to trees and all sorts of strange stuff like that. Nobody ever knew where that bunker came from, what it was actually used for. There was never any proof to definitively tie it to any kind of satanic cult. But along with the bunker, there was also what I think was later described as like an ice fishing hut in the middle of the woods, not far from a very large cranberry bog in Freetown. That was supposedly a place where there was satanic activity going on as well. And that hut developed a reputation for being tied to that Fall River satanic cult, although that was never proven either. And in the documentary, we actually find the remains of both the bunker and the hut.
Jay, you got any more questions? I have a few more.
Well, I kind of wanted to go back a little bit off of that particular thread. It just got me thinking. You mentioned that the UFO sighting back in 1904? Did you say?
Oh wait, yeah.
1908. I know there's a lot of really old towns in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I just thought it occurred to me it would be an interesting project to go to some of the like historical societies or the newspapers. There's got to be some stuff that goes back like couple hundred years, I would assume, right?
Yeah. I mean, if you go to the Bridgewater Library, they actually have a file on the Bridgewater Triangle. You can actually ask for the file, and that file might contain some old newspaper articles. The problem with old newspaper articles is you got to manually search them day by day, looking for any kind of bizarre story. You know what I mean?
Microfiche.
Microfilm. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, you know, a lot of these, some of the oldest communities in the country. I mean, I live in Dartmouth, which I think was founded in 1660 something. I mean, these towns go way, way back, and most of the towns are named after towns in England. A lot of the towns in Massachusetts.
Right.
If there's a Dartmouth, England, Dartmouth, Massachusetts, you know, all those towns usually have an equivalent in England.
Sure. Right.
One of the things that I found in the documentary that I'd never heard of, now I'm more of a history guy than anything else, was Dighton Rock.
Yeah.
It seems like an incredible find. What are your theories on that? Or tell us
Yeah, the Dighton Rock, so it's this gigantic multi-ton trapezoid-shaped boulder that was sitting in the Taunton River, and the boulder has a big flat face on it. And this is in, actually, technically, the rock is in Berkeley. It's called Dighton Rock, but it's actually in Berkeley near the Dighton-Berkeley line. I don't know who initially found the rock, but the rock appears to have all these bizarre inscriptions on it. And now the rock has been lifted out. You can see it on the screen here. Yep, there's Dighton Rock. It was lifted out of the water and put in this pagoda museum in Berkeley. And there are a number of different theories as to where the inscriptions came from. One of them being the Native American, Phoenician, seeing that up on the screen, the Viking theory, Portuguese explorers in the 1500s is one of the theories. And we do have a very high Portuguese population in southeastern Massachusetts. As a matter of fact, the most dense Portuguese population in the country. But you have all these different scholars that have all these different theories as to where the inscriptions came from. And one of the theories is that it could have been like a billboard where multiple cultures that passed through made their own marks on the boulder. Right. But it's really an interesting thing. It's kind of like a hidden gem in southeastern Massachusetts. It's a brief, short drive from the Freetown State Forest. It's the same park rangers that administer that facility that also work in the Freetown State Forest. So I would highly recommend anybody that's local or even not local, if they get to Massachusetts, to check out Dighton Rock.
Do they look like inscriptions to you, or does it look like just symbols? I mean, because obviously the Native Americans didn't have written language, so
there is no real discernible like letters on there. One of the researchers, what the heck was his name? Doctor, is a Portuguese guy. I can't remember his last name. But he thought he could see the inscription of the year 1511 on there, but I'm not convinced of it. Right. So, whether these are like hieroglyphics or have some sort of an ancient significance, that's one of the debates among the scholars.
Okay. Jay?
Oh, no, sorry. I was just nodding along with what he was saying.
That's coincidentally, Dighton Rock is a very short distance from Profile Rock, which is also mentioned in the documentary, which is technically part of the Freetown State Forest in Freetown. Profile Rock was basically our local version of Old Man on the Mountain up in New Hampshire. It was a glacial rock formation where if you stood at it at a certain vantage point, it was this absolutely perfect profile of a man's face. And of course, they say it was the face of a Native American. And the Profile Rock stood proudly in Freetown for years and years and years. And then just like Old Man on the Mountain, in 2019, Profile Rock collapsed. Enough water had seeped into the rocks and froze and expanded the rock that Profile Rock just completely collapsed. The park ranger went to open the park one day, and Profile Rock was no more. You can still visit the site. You can still climb the glacial rock formation to above the tree line. But the stone face, which you can see there, is no longer there. It collapsed in 2019.
Oh, that's just like the Old Man on the Mountain in New Hampshire.
I actually think the Profile Rock looks even more like a face than Old Man on the Mountain did, but it's really that was a really sad thing when Profile Rock collapsed.
Is there still a large native population in the area, Aaron?
I wouldn't say large. I mean, I think what you see in the United States is that the further east you go, the less Native Americans you see, because it's longer ago in history that their people were wiped off the map.
Right.
So in Massachusetts, I mean, we do have Wampanoag. There's different bands of the Wampanoag tribe. You get the Narragansetts down in Rhode Island. You got the Mohegan out in Connecticut. So there are Native Americans in this part of the country. What percentage of the population they make up, I couldn't tell you. But there is a Wampanoag reservation in the Freetown State Forest. And when I say reservation, I don't mean like a place where they actually live. It's a plot of land that is dedicated to the Native Americans where they can conduct their ceremonies.
Right.
So there is a I guess a healthy Native American population, enough that they're able to organize and govern themselves and conduct their own events and things like that. And a lot of that happens in the Freetown State Forest. And I know they hold rituals and ceremonies at Profile Rock.
Interesting. Thank you.
One of the more interesting stories was the two reporters from Channel 5. Let me
Oh, then yeah, the UFO story.
Former WHDH reporters Jerry Lopes and Steve Sprasia claim to have witnessed what is arguably the most famous UFO sighting to occur within the Bridgewater Triangle.
Jerry Lopes and I worked at WHDH Radio, and we were heading down to the Raynham dog track, and when we got off 24 onto 106, I noticed this really bright light over the tree line, and the light was coming closer and closer and getting bigger and bigger. And I remember saying to Jerry, "What is that over there?" So we pulled his vehicle over, and all of a sudden the stars blotted out in the shape of an arrow as this thing passed overhead.
Ironically, I'm a big baseball fan. It looked like a baseball home plate, and there were a series of lights on it.
And it was very, very wide, perhaps the width of now we'd say 5 747s wing to wing.
It looked like it had a little cord or something hanging off it, and sparks were coming off of it. I could throw a rock at the thing. It seemed that close to me.
This was pretty much the shape of it. And this thing passed overhead like this. For me, what first attracted me was this light that kind of came into our field of vision, just like that. And as this thing passed overhead, it just kept coming and coming and coming. And the light kept getting bigger and bigger.
I'm an Air Force veteran. I've been in the Air Force for 4.5 years. I've been around a number of different planes. And I said to Steve, that's not one of ours. And it just hovered there for a minute. It looked like it was over a little bit of a field. And the next thing you know, it just kind of took off.
We continued on to the dog track. And most of the conversation that evening was, what did we see? Up to that point, I had been 100% skeptic. I thought anybody who ever saw these things, they were either crazy or publicity hounds, or there was just something wrong with them in their head altogether. What I didn't realize at the time was that a lot more people had seen it than just Jerry and I.
Interestingly, over the course of the next week, there were a series of spottings, different sightings. It was reported in the papers, reported on the radio station. And at that point, Steve and I decided to come forward and say, hey, we actually saw something.
A couple of days later, an article appears in the Brockton Enterprise. And not only does it have interviews with Jerry and I, but quite a number of other folks in and around the Randolph area who had seen it. But they've got the staff artists take all of our recollections and put together a drawing, an artist rendition, which looked pretty much like this. And it's like, whoa. I keep looking up because even to this day, as I look up, I can imagine I can see the darn thing. It made that much of an impression on me.
So I think that was really, really interesting. Obviously, these guys seem like very compelling witnesses. You know, they're not people that were eager to be a part of something like that. What did you think, Aaron?
Yeah, that was one of a handful, well, maybe the two best stories to come out of the Bridgewater Triangle documentary. That story was known before the documentary, but that's one of my favorites. Even as a hardcore skeptic, there's no doubt that there was a bizarre craft flying over the skies of the region at that time. Just the sheer number of witnesses that went to the Brockton Enterprise with that same matching story, with the same physical description of the craft. And there was an interview after that section of the documentary. We interview a guy named Ron Baker, who saw that same craft in 1979 around that time. So, you know, whether it was of an extraterrestrial origin or some sort of a top secret government craft, I guess we'll never have the answer to it. But that's one of my favorite stories. Those guys at the time, I don't think they knew anything about the existence of the Bridgewater Triangle. They were just on their way to the dog track from after work and had this incredible sighting of this craft.
They came out with they didn't like wait until they retired from their news careers or something. So they had reputations to lose. I mean, they were public figures. They had a lot on the line coming out with something like that, which to me lends more credence to the whole idea.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And there was the 70s in particular, the late 70s were there was a high volume of reports of UFOs coming out of that Bridgewater Triangle in South Shore, Massachusetts region.
Interesting. Yeah.
So, Aaron, I'm also interested in the archaeological dig in the 1920s where they found the red ochre, and there's some kind of strange mystery about that.
Yeah. So that was a guy named Professor Delabar, who was, I believe, a professor at Brown University. There was an area right across from the Dighton Rock Museum. You can see it from the Dighton Rock Museum, called Grassy Island, which is eroded over time, sometimes at high tide, because the Taunton River leads out to the ocean, so the tides affect the Taunton River. Sometimes at high tide, that grassy island's barely even visible. But supposedly they did an archaeological dig, at Grassy Island, and the story goes that when they opened these tombs or graves, red ochre that was then exposed to the elements like mysteriously bubbled and dissolved away. And then one of the other stories is that none of the photographs taken of that excavation developed. They all failed to develop. So it's just another one of those really bizarre stories that come out of the air, and it just happened to be right there at the same location as Dighton Rock, which lends some credence to the Native American origins theory for the rock itself.
Well, I'm sorry. What year was that, Aaron?
Yeah,
19th century.
1920s. Yeah, 1920s. I'm not sure the exact date. I should know that. It's actually this October is the 10-year anniversary of the release of the documentary. So it's been a little while since I did the research.
Mm-hmm.
Close enough. Yeah.
Let me play one more clip, because this is about a Bigfoot story you had in here, and who doesn't love a good Bigfoot story?
Sure, absolutely.
So
For 3 days, there was concerted safari.
Oh, here we go.
This is the end of a dog story, but
try to find this giant dog.
we jump right into
And
Bigfoot.
nobody ever could.
You're hitting all the big points here. Here we go.
Perhaps the most intriguing yet lesser known report of a cryptic animal sighting in the Hockomock Swamp occurred in 1990. Former Raynham resident William Russo will never forget his amazing up-close and personal encounter.
Back in the late 1980s to about the mid-1990s, I was working a 3 to midnight shift in the town of Raynham where I lived. And that's when my strange happening occurred. When I got off work every night at midnight, I'd walk my dog, Samantha. She was a Rottweiler Shepherd mix, big, around 90 pounds. Now, usually we walked on the sidewalks towards the center of town. But on this particular night, we walked a different route. I don't really know why, but we did. Right behind my house is an area we called the High T's, claimed by the electric company. They run those high tension wires. It's about 50 feet across and overgrown with 100-foot pines. So it's kind of like a route for kids who want to take shortcuts and who knows what kind of wildlife during the day. And at night, maybe stranger things. I went perhaps a half a mile when I came to an old water wheel that ran an early ironworks back a couple of 100 years ago. And there's a street light at this road, and the street light casts a big circle of light right in the middle of the street, about a 10-foot radius. So as I approached the road, all of a sudden, Sammy, my dog, started to pull at the leash. And I looked down and she was quivering, she was shaking, she was rattling like an old Chevy. And then a few moments later, I heard what was scaring the dog. It was a high-pitched, almost a wail. And it went like this. It went, "He want you. He want you. Here. Here. He want you." Now the hairs on my back of my neck started to go up, and Sammy, of course, she was just absolutely in terror. And suddenly I saw something walk. It was erect, standing straight up. It walked into the middle of that circle of light that was cast by the street lamp. It was about 3 or 4 feet tall. It had a pot belly. And as I walked a little closer, I saw that it wasn't clothed. It had hair that was maybe 3, 4 inches long, totally covered in hair. It had eyes that were perhaps a little big for its head, but not hugely disproportionate. The face perhaps looked like the chipmunk. At first, I thought it was a child, but as I analyzed it, I thought it was in the beginning stages of old age. I don't think it was young. Whatever it wasn't young, but it was speaking. I mean, it definitely speaking, and it kept saying, "Ewan Chu, Ewan Chu," got more insistent, and it started beckoning me. "Here, here, Ewan Chu." It wasn't threatening me, but what was weird, it wasn't advancing to me. It didn't come near me. It wanted to get me in its space. This is what I felt like. I wish I could say that I was brave enough to go right up and, get that close from it, but I couldn't. I was scared. And my Samantha was scared, so we turned around and we walked home pretty fast. And I stayed up the whole night analyzing, what could this be? What could this be? And here's what I think it was saying. My best guess is, Ewan Chu is, we want you. We want you. Here, come here, come here. I think it was speaking English. I rarely told anyone about it. I didn't know at the time the stories about the Bridgewater Triangle. I've never seen anything paranormal. I just didn't feel like sharing the story, but that was almost 20 years ago. And I'm getting up in age, and I felt I should pass it along. So I wrote a little internet blog on it, and I want to share it. I want people to know about it. I went back many times and never again saw it.
So I guess that was actually Littlefoot, not Bigfoot. Sorry about that.
That clip that you just played is by far the most popular story featured in our documentary. That is the one that everybody walked away from that film remembering and talking about.
Could that have been a Pudgewucky or?
Yeah, that's one of the theories that what Bill Russo saw could have been a Pukwudgie. Although he didn't see it in the Freetown State Forest, he saw it closer to the Hockomock Swamp area.
I see.
So what about Bigfoot? Does he make an appearance? I seem to remember seeing him in the documentary, but now I can't find it. But was there a lot of...
Yeah, he's earlier in the film. He's probably about, 10 to 15 minutes into the film. There were a number of alleged Bigfoot sightings in Bridgewater. In 1970, there was supposedly a series of bear sightings in the Bridgewater area. Now, black bear are not known to be in southeastern Massachusetts very often. Occasionally you'll get one that wanders down, but they were pretty much eradicated from southeastern Massachusetts. And in 1970, there were these sightings of this alleged bear-type creature. And one of the stories was that there was a Bridgewater police officer in his cruiser while looking for this creature. And whatever it was, picked his whole cruiser up off the back wheels and then dropped it back down on the ground. And he spun his flashlight around and saw like a hairy creature going into the woods. And when we were screening this documentary in 2013-14, the daughter of that cop actually showed up at one of our showings of the film. He had since passed away, but she said he swore by that story that something that he did not think was necessarily a bear picked up the rear end of his police cruiser and dropped it on the ground. And probably the most famous Bigfoot sighting in the Bridgewater Triangle occurred in 1978 at a place called Claybanks Pond in Bridgewater, and was cited by this guy, Joseph DeAndrade. He's the guy who decks himself out in the safari gear and launches expeditions into the swamp to this day, trying to find the Bigfoot that he claims that he saw in 1978. He's a very colorful character, very interesting person. And his sighting is probably the most famous, although maybe now since the documentary, the Bill Russo Pukwudgie or alleged Pukwudgie sighting might be the most famous, but prior to that was probably Joseph DeAndrade in 1978.
Yeah, I wonder, I think I remember hearing somewhere that in California, it's against the law to shoot a Bigfoot.
Really?
I wonder if that's the same, because I remember that guy from the documentary with the safari hat. And he has
Joseph DeAndrade.
Like a gigantic elephant gun or something like that. And I always wondered if there's a similar law that you can't shoot them.
I don't think Massachusetts has as many Bigfoot sightings as California, but I don't know. I'm not aware of any laws like that on the books, but could be.
Pretty sure you can't shoot anything in Massachusetts, but
Yeah, you pretty much can't.
Well, I mean, one last thing that interested me was the snakes.
Oh yeah.
Because you know, when you have an area like that is very primordial, kind of have creatures that are in their habitat for a long time, and they could grow larger than normal, I would say.
Yeah, I think the snake story came out of in the 30s when Roosevelt was doing the New Deal stuff. There was the CCP was the civilian corps was doing some work in the swamp, and the workers allegedly saw this gigantic snake the size of a stovepipe that poked its head up out of the swamp, and they all went running out of the swamp. And you know, snakes of that size are not native to Massachusetts, so that the Conservation Corps snake story is probably one of the more popular ones to come out of the area.
Yep, absolutely. It reminds me of the Gloucester sea monster or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. I've heard of that as well. Yeah.
All right. Well, Aaron, thank you very much for coming on. So what else are you working on these days? And are you available to, you do outstanding work with your documentaries? If people want to hire you, can they hire you to do some kind of documentary they got?
So I do video production for a living. I run a company called Bristol County Media. The website's bristolcountymedia.com. The Bridgewater Triangle is probably the most famous documentary that I've done. But for the last almost decade now, I've been working on a multi-episode true crime documentary series about the unsolved New Bedford highway murders. So that's been an ongoing project. That's actually, the Bridgewater Triangle was a single 90-minute film, whereas the highway murders is built as a 7-part series, with each episode running between 75 to 90 minutes right now. And we're currently trying to find a buyer for that project. But just generally, I make a living doing television commercials, corporate videos, anything pretty much video production related, I do it. So.
And that's Bristol County Productions?
Bristol County Media.
Bristol County Media. So if anybody wants to hire Aaron, he's obviously a really smart guy who gets deep into this work, and his production values are going to be very high. So Bristol County Media.
Thank you very much.
Anything else, Jay? You have any final questions for Aaron?
No, just a pleasure to meet you, Aaron. And you've given me a lot of good ideas for the show moving forward. There's some stuff I want to dig into. So thanks so much.
The Bridgewater Triangle is a limitless. I mean, we barely scratched the surface on the Bridgewater Triangle. So you could fill a whole nother show with just Bridgewater Triangle related content. You could do an episode on each individual location, most likely. You know, you could do a whole show on Hockomock Swamp, whole show on the Freetown State Forest. It's really limitless.
I'd like to get up there at some point too, and maybe poke around at some point in the future. We'll see if that comes to pass.
Yeah, I would say late fall would be the best time. Mid to late fall.
Okay.
Okay, that would be great. So, again, everybody, we're going to be doing Yellow Cottage X as a regular thing. We'll be doing recorded shows and live shows. I don't know if we'll do a live every Friday, but maybe we will. But this is Jay in New York, and so please, if you have any good stories, reach out to me, reach out to Jay, reach out to the channel. Any tips, anything you think we should be looking into? We just want to have fun with these stories. So thank you, and good night, everybody. Have a good Friday.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you for having me.